Cool, there we go. Okay, can everybody see that? I'll take that as yes, brilliant. I can't really see people when I'm talking, unfortunately. Hence the need for the chat function. So here we are, learning together, financing your community-led housing project. So this session will run for about an hour, and it's kind of a broad brush, I guess, rather than really getting down into the detail of some of it. But I'll hope to introduce some different terms, and some of you will already know these different terms, and I apologize in advance if I'm teaching people what they already know, but obviously there's a wide range of different kind of knowledge levels on the call. Generally, so yeah, you will know some of them, and some people will be really glad to get a kind of more detailed introduction to them. And then I'm going to talk about 6 different common scenarios that I have come across in my role here at the Wales Co-op Centre, and previously as a member of a housing co-op and a co-housing project. So we'll talk about this because I thought it'd be useful to look at it from the point of view of projects that have already set up and how they went about financing their community-led housing project. And I've mostly chosen ones that are already set up and running, or in the process of being built at the moment, so you know that these things do work, and they are people who are successfully living in the projects. So, as I said, it's a quick tour of successful community-led housing projects and how they work financially. And specifically what we're going to be looking at today is really in the area around that you'd call financial modelling, rather than business planning, because we talked about business planning. Paul gave a really great presentation last week about business planning, which is available on our Communities Creating Homes YouTube channel. So you can kind of see what he had to say about business planning. So I'm not really going to talk about that this week, but I am going to talk about financial modelling, which comes into these kind of decisions that you'll have to make as a group at some point. So many of you on the call will know this already, but the housing sector, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this because it's important in terms of what decisions you make at an early stage of your project. Housing sector is roughly divided into these 3 areas: social housing, market rate housing, and affordable and intermediate rate housing. Social and market rate, we probably know quite a lot about. Affordable intermediate has kind of a variety of different definitions from the government's kind of 80% of market value, but it kind of really goes in between anything in between social housing rates and market rates. And that's kind of, I mean, our project is really aimed at people who are kind of create social rent housing or affordable intermediate. We don't really work that much with groups who kind of are in the market rate sector, but community-led housing exists in all these parts, and in some cases they sort of cross between them, and that's a decision that a group is going to have to make quite early on in terms of the financing and generally in terms of what sort of project they want, whether it's just going to be social housing, market rate, or something in between, or a bit of both. And yeah, that's some of the projects that I'll be talking about later on fit in those categories. So as some of you will know, there's different types of tenure: rental, own, shared ownership. These are the kind of 3 most common types of tenure, by which I mean the way people occupy houses. So they either rent, they own them, or they have some sort of shared ownership in the properties that they live in. And again, community-led housing crosses into all these different areas, and some are mixed, and that's quite important in kind of deciphering your financial model, which we'll go on to talk about a bit in some of the case studies that I go on to discuss. Again, primary sources of funding. So capital, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment, community funding and income from rent. And they may come in different phases of your project. So, you know, you're not going to get income from rent until you've actually built the houses and moved in. You will get capital beforehand, either in the form of a loan or existing capital from private sources, from people who are involved in the project or from somewhere else. And you will seek to get community funding almost certainly as part of your project. And I'll go on to talk a little bit about what that means later on. But those tend to be the kind of three of the main sources of funding for any project that happens really in the community-led housing world. And again, there you are, there's our little community-led housing projects in all of them. So I'm just going to admit somebody. And for those of you who don't know, there's two broad types of funding and spending. Capital funding tends to be your big picture stuff. You're buying the land, building the houses, or buying property, fitting them out, bedrooms and kitchens, infrastructure, energy. And then on the other side, there's revenue, which is the spending that has to happen as you're going along, in a sense, to kind of maintain and run the project. And that happens in various phases of the project, and it will change as you go along. And I'll talk about the phases that you can kind of identify quite easily in community-led housing in a moment. But there could be things like dealing with health and safety. They've got a slip hazard going on there, maintenance lists, getting people in to fix things. It could be around getting teaching, consultancy, supporting people moving into the project or being part of it. It could be, I've got a little bus on there because it could be trips out to see different projects. And that obviously all costs money as well. That's the sort of thing that you might do in the first phase of your community-led housing project, but you have to get that money from somewhere. And obviously for some people, that's even that is impossible to afford without some sort of support. And again, different sources of revenue. Again, you could split it up between capital and revenue. Capital, again, for your big picture, big expenditure parts, mortgage, bank loans, private capital, public funds, community investment and institutional funding. And then for revenue, it tends to be to pay for ongoing costs once you've established, rents, service fees, some to a lesser extent donations, and sometimes there's some grants available. So that's just a kind of broad picture, and there's obviously a lot more detail that we could go into around that on a one-to-one basis if you wanted to kind of talk to us about that as a project. So as I said, there's different phases of community-led housing, and these tend to be the ones that are kind of readily identified, and we all work around these phases in the community-led housing sector. And that's the group, site, plan, build, live phases. And I've added an extra one, which is expand, because you may want to think about that in terms of financial modelling right at the beginning of the project. How much further, what do you want to do next? What do you want to develop next? So the group is for group formation, getting together as a group of people, looking at your different options. Site is obviously finding the site and purchasing the site. Planning is around how you're going to deliver the houses that you want on that site. And then build is obvious, really, it's the actual building phase. And then living is how you're going to make it work financially when you're actually all moved in and living in the project. So groups will look at different kind of financial models potentially for each of these phases. It's going to be more simple in the group phase because that's fairly minor costs, and we can offer support in that phase if you're in the Explore programme, which is run by Development Trust Association Wales in association with Wales Co-op Centre. And there's a pot of money there, a couple of £1,000 and some mentor support. for you developing, if you don't know what your model is going to be or where your site is, for example, for developing a group. And there may be other community small pots of funding out there in the group phase. And site, probably looking at mortgage and loans and things like that. And then the build is potentially where you're getting capital from existing members or from the mortgage and so on and so forth. So there'll be different kind of financial models that you want to create for each of those different phases, and they'll get more complicated the further you go on. Now, running up to the build phase, we've got a booklet on finance and financial modelling, which I'll make available to you hopefully in the chat at the end of this, or I'll send it on to you separately afterwards. And you can see in there we've got different phases of the kind of financial modelling, but basically running up to the build phase, this is common areas where people will kind of a process that people will follow to get to where they want to. And I'll make these slides available to you as well, so you can also follow up on this and take a closer look. I'm not going to go through it all today. But you'll have to think about the financing at different stages. So yeah, bring out your abacus or your calculator and your spreadsheets to sense check really how you're doing as you're going along. So you might start off with a very simple financial model that gives you a broad picture about whether a project is going to work, which will have to get more complicated, as I suggested earlier, as you go along, until the point where you're getting into kind of really serious spreadsheets and financial models to tell you whether you are going to move ahead with the site purchase and whether this is all going to work. But really, you need to know quite early on whether your idea has legs, if you like, whether it's going to kind of move forward and actually work, because there's, in a sense, not much point in doing all the rest of it if the basic premise of what you'd like to do is not going to work. So sometimes this is called, we use different language. Perhaps if you're working in partnership with a registered social landlord, they might use this kind of language: pre-development, development, habitation. Kind of most of that is self-explanatory, but pre-development can mean different things in different types of projects. So if you're buying a house, the pre-development part of it could be getting a surveyor's report, paying your first mortgage fee, getting your solicitor's fees paid and things like that. Development would be actually when you're on site, building, renovating, adding extra units. And then habitation is when you're all ready to move in and how the finances are going to work once you're all living on site. Just different terminologies to sort of get used to. Really, it's helpful to just chat about that before. So yeah, the basics around any spreadsheets, and anybody who'll really running a household budget will know this, but it's all around income and expenditure. Obviously, it gets more complicated the more houses you're trying to occupy as a group. So a fairly simple kind of one house housing co-op is going to be a lot easier to deliver and manage and maintain financially than something that's developing and building 20 new builds with different types of tenure and different sizes of houses and yeah, different turnovers potentially and things like that. So there's a lot more management to do. And it really, what you obviously don't want to do is let the expenditure run away with you so you become imbalanced against your income. And the expenditure can look like these three categories are quite big parts of it: debt or debt management, paying interest, running costs, maintenance, things like that. Major works is any kind of renovation work or big fixes that you're going to have to make on the project. And then income is through funding and rents and fees, which I've kind of already talked about a little bit. And what that has to fit into in practice is something that looks something like this. And this is a spreadsheet, but it's also what we'd call a financial model. And I'm not going to go too much into the detail of all this because it's far too kind of complicated to do on a webinar session like this. But some point fairly early on the project, you will want to work with a financial modeler who can support you in developing the spreadsheet that will effectively stay with you for the rest of the life of the project. And bearing in mind that the project could go on for 30, 40 years, that's the sort of kind of time frame you want to be thinking about in terms of people, keeping people happily housed in your housing project for a long time, 40-year mortgages and so on. This is actually for a housing co-op. And again, the financial model is going to be is simpler than for a bigger project with multiple houses. Yeah, as you can see, there's quite a lot of numbers to get your head around. And then you will work with a financial modeler to play around with your figures to make sure that it is going to work. And the reason for doing that is because, well, you don't want to fail early on. You don't want the people who've moved into your housing to become homeless, worst case scenarios. You will have to prove yourself to the bank, and they'll want to see all these figures to make sure that you've done the work that you need to do to make sure that they're not going to have to foreclose on you or claim their mortgage back or any of those scenarios. And you'll have to have this sort of spreadsheet financial model for funders as well. And to prove, especially, well, if you're going out to the community and asking them to support you, they'll want to know that what they're giving their money to in quite often support that isn't financially guaranteed, that they're going to get a good chance of getting their investment back after the 5 or 10 years that they've invested it for. I'll go on to talk a little bit about those different kind of financial mechanisms. Important to say also that we can give groups in Wales support in terms of a relationship with a financial modeler. We can pay for a group to have some kind of financial modeling training. I'm not a qualified financial modeler. We can talk to you about a lot of things, but within the Communities Creating Homes programme, if we need extra advice, we will go out and get it from people and give you that support. This is just a quick breakdown of some of the costs that you can encounter as a group and as a project going forward. Again, I'm not really going to go into all the details of this, but you can see it on the screen, and I'll share the slides with you by email them. But yeah, those are the different sort of things you're going to have to be thinking about. And they will vary from project to project, so which is why it's really important to kind of work with a financial modeler to make sure your project has the right costs and against it. So I'll just pause briefly there and ask if there are any questions at this point. If anybody wants to take off their mic, turn on their mic, sorry, and ask, then I'd be happy to answer. But if not, I'll just go on.
Alan, it's Tony here.
Hi, Tony.
Doesn't some of this modeling you're showing us presume that community-led housing group would also be a registered social landlord? Okay,
so it's in Wales, community-led housing projects can't be registered social landlords, or it's very unlikely that they would become registered social landlords. So they would have to work with housing associations. There may be parts of these financial models that come from registered social landlord kind of model, but these are just meant for kind of general picture painting, if you like, in specifics. Thank you. That is different in England. There are community-led housing groups that do become registered providers in England, but that doesn't tend to be an option in Wales. But of course, you can work in partnership with a registered social provider. So what all projects need to be sure of: income, cash flow, ring-fence services, ring-fence reserves. So again, this is going to be stuff that a lot of you know about, but you need to know where your income is going to come from over the long term. You need to know what expenditure you're going to have, but more importantly, or as importantly to that, when you're going to have to spend it. Because if you don't manage your cash flow, then effectively you can become bankrupt as a project and close. So the financial model will help you identify the places, the points in time when you're going to have to spend certain pots of money. For example, if you've got an investment through loan stock, which is a type of community funding, then you're likely to have a point after 5 years when you're going to have to pay some of that investment back to people. So you'd have to build that into your model. At 5 years' time, our project is going to have to save up enough and put them in ring-fence reserves so that we have that money to pay back against people. Obviously, year on year, there are going to be points in the year when you're going to have to pay out money as well, and you have to manage that through your rental income or your service charges, or however your ongoing income is managed. So I think most groups, when they start off, they are thinking in broad picture. This is the kind of where I'm going to get my money from. They've got an idea, and this is where the money is going to come from. But it's quite floaty ideas at the beginning. Maybe loads of groups don't actually know the details of how all these things work because they've never built houses before, and this is their first time. So I guess our process as the Wales Co-op Centre is to support groups through that and try and kind of get more of a functional mentality about how those things are all going to work together, which is why I've kind of pictured these as great cogs moving each other around and building the kind of energy that you need for the project. And they're not, the sizes of them are not specific for all community-led housing projects. They do vary. Sometimes the grant funding, for example, if you're working with a registered social landlord in Wales or registered provider in England, there will be a certain amount of grant from the housing association or local authority to support the project. In Wales, it's 58% social housing grant. That isn't available to community groups that aren't working with registered social landlords. So they're going to have more money from elsewhere. So the size of these cogs will vary, but in a broad brush, that's where much of the money is going to come from in different community-led housing projects. So yeah, I'm going to go on now to talk about 6 common scenarios. And scenarios tend to emerge at the beginning of the project. It's what people want out of a project. And it comes around this idea of defining your vision, your values and aims. And it comes up in conversations in your steering groups and the formation of the project right at the beginning. And possibly through researching CLH models, as you can see there. And the scenario will define what the project will be, essentially. And I've tried to do it this way because I think it helps you understand the different range of different models and how that kind of fits into real world situations. So one really common scenario is this one. We've got our own capital. We want to own our own home and sell on if our life circumstances change. And this is more or less a market rate. This is working within the market, but creating community-led housing projects that responds to the market. And this is a project in Cambridge called Marmalade Lane Co-housing. And I've put in the text there how long the project took to develop. So it's about 10 years. This is market rate, as I say, exists within the market, but they did get support from Cambridge City Council, who identified the site that actually came up from bankruptcy from a developer after the last financial crisis. And they paid for a project manager in the early stages to help support a group to get going. And then they secured financing through a Swedish construction company called Trivselhus, who wanted to find a way into the UK market. And this seemed like a really good way of doing it. And the developer held the construction costs. They got some investment from the members themselves in terms of capital that they had from sales of other houses and from mortgages. And then the houses were effectively sold from the developer straight to the buyers, the homeowners. And there's advantages and disadvantages of that in terms of the community. There's less control as a community group about who moves in, but there's ease for people who do want this model to be able to sell if they have to for whatever life circumstances come up. And this is a co-housing project, so they also built a community house as part of the project, and they all the members who live there work in different groups, and you know, it's very much a community-led housing project, but working within the private model. So the cogs there, the private capital, some developer financing, as you saw, and then some council support, but I guess quite a kind of smaller amount of council support compared to other projects. But this does come up quite often in projects, that there is some sort of local council support behind it all.
Alan?
Yeah.
Can I just jump in to highlight a question in the chat?
Brilliant, thanks you.
Gemma Ray, what is loan stock?
So I will go on to talk about loan stock in a minute, but I can do it now. Loan stock is an unsecured investment. It's a way of asking people for support to invest in a housing co-op. What it means is that people agree to loan a certain amount of money, usually in chunks of something like £1,000, to the housing co-op for 5 years, sometimes longer, could be 10, 15 years. And then at the end of that period, they get their loans back with interest. So that's effectively what loan stock is. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So this is another project that's actually used loan stock as well. This is Chapeltown Co-housing. We had them at one of our network meetings a couple of months back. Oh, somebody's outside, wants to come back in. Yeah, so this is a scenario where some people have capital, but they want to include people who don't. And this comes up quite a lot in conversations with groups I have in Wales. And they've created a mixed tenure approach. So there's owner occupied with some rental, and they've committed as a group to not being above the local housing allowance in terms of rentals. So they can bring in as wide a group as possible into the project. And there you can see they've allowed people to own between 25 and 99% of the house and pay the rest in rent, or you can fully rent in the project. So if some people have capital, that means they can bring it to the project and pay less rent. If people don't have capital, then they will pay a smaller amount or more rent. And that's quite a complicated kind of financial model that they've created. But again, you can see that the three main points of that is the mortgage, grant funding. They got support from grant funding, from which is available in England, unfortunately not available in Wales at the moment. And then they've got support from the community. Hugh, I see there's a few more questions coming into the chat. Do I need to respond to those now?
I think Casey's been responding as we go.
Okay, all right, brilliant, thank you. So this is what their kind of financial model looks like in terms of where the different pots of money come from. As you can see from there, there's a split between long-term borrowing and purchase income and deposits, where most of the money is coming from, and then some grants and donations. And there's that loan stock again at 12%. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail about that today, but I can let you have these slides afterwards. And why they need that extra loan stock funding is because the mortgage will only pay a certain amount, the loan to value ratio of the house, which is in this case 70%. So they can borrow that much of the house value, and then the rest has to come from other sources, which includes loan stock and then capital from other members. So it's kind of quite a complicated financial model to work out where all that kind of different money is going to come from to make it all work. And in briefly here, you can see the different types of houses that they're making available to people, the nominal value that they've had to give that to the bank, and then the sort of different models that they're making available to people. So if you have a 50% ownership, then you can pay 50% purchase price on that for 1-bed flat, and then the rest in monthly rental. So the co-op, this is a housing co-op, and they control the last percentage share of all the houses. So if you want to sell that house, you have to go through the housing co-op, and that allows them to maintain the kind of cohesive community that they wish in that particular project, and also to meet other targets that they've identified as part of their kind of vision and values work that they've done as a group. Third scenario is some of us have capital, but we want to include social housing tenants, specifically social housing tenants in our plan. This is the Older Women's Co-housing project in London. It's a mix of owner-occupied properties, and then, as I say, housing association rentals. And this is quite an interesting process because the housing association manages the housing need part of it and identifies people who have the housing need. But in addition to the housing need, they also have to go through the recruitment process of the project themselves, so which is the same with the owner-occupied houses as well. So everybody has to go through this process of becoming a member, a non-residential member, seeing how it all works, and then becoming a residential member. But this is a way of creating an integrated community, really, and trying not to exclude people or create gated property developments that there is a danger of doing with some community-led housing projects. And they got funding through the Tudor Trust as well, so there is some additional funding from a grant. And again, you can see the basic sources of funding: private capital, social housing, and grant. Scenario 4, we want everyone to pay contributions as a percentage of income. This is another type of affordable housing project. This is LILAC in Leeds, which stands for Low Impact Living and Community. And the members here are required to pay a very small capital contribution, but they have a mortgage for the whole property, and there's over 20 homes in this kind of development, and each member pays 35% of their income towards a joint mortgage. So this is a very kind of egalitarian project, that no matter how much or little you earn as your income, then you'll pay 35% of that. And there's a whole load of complicated kind of financial models behind all that. There's software kind of monitoring that income and expenditure, which I don't have time to go into detail on this call, but again, there's kind of information that I can make available to people afterwards. But this model is called mutual home ownership, and there's not many of them around the UK at the moment. Say about 4 or 5. And again, here you can see on the slide that Leeds City Council were involved in making land available to the project, which again allowed them to create the affordability and not to be in the market value kind of part of housing developments. They also got funding for the actual construction because they used innovative construction technique using straw bale construction technique and paneling. So that's another way that housing project can lever in financing. by identifying funds that might be funding something else. There's a project in Wales, existing project, that is using revenue from renewable heat incentive to go towards their kind of long-term costs. So there may be other ways, other kind of sources of funding that you can identify as you going along that can support, that are might not immediately be obvious.
Alan, can I jump in
Yes,
to draw your
please.
attention
Thank
to a couple more questions?
Mm-hmm.
Question from Ren, sorry, Ren, I think you asked this one about 5 minutes ago, so I think it related to the eich model, older women's co-housing. How is the monthly rent element of shared ownership worked out, and does it match the term of the mortgage?
Oh, okay. So eich is not a shared ownership model. So maybe it relates to the Chapeltown co-housing. Ren, do you want to come on to speak onto the microphone and ask the question? Was it related to eich or to?
No, it was the one where you'd own 50% of the property, and then the other 50% would be paid in rent.
That's it. That's Chapeltown co-housing.
Right.
Yes.
Sorry,
and what was the question, Ren, related to that?
It was how is the monthly rental element worked out? I mean, you're buying 50% on a mortgage. You've got your mortgage repayments. How does the community housing association work out what the rental element's going to be?
That is a question, unfortunately, I can't answer for you, but I will get in contact with them and ask,
okay,
and get back in touch with you afterwards. It's probably quite a complicated spreadsheet and financial model.
okay.
But yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Ren.
And another question from Gavin. Gavin, do you want to jump in and ask that yourself?
Yeah, sure. So if you want the property, the housing stock to be permanently affordable, am I right in thinking that it's better to avoid ownership models, because the natural side effect of that is that prices of the property increase over time when people buy and sell?
So I think like the MHOS model, which is the Leeds model, Lilac model, that with their model, they all own, they all have a stake in the housing and they all pay into it. And when they leave, they get a certain percentage back. But the house prices themselves are not linked to the market. So the house prices remain affordable in perpetuity. So I think that's how they've tried to get around that. Now, this does create a problem, because obviously everywhere else, or in most circumstances, the house prices are going up. So if you leave Lilac, then you will get some money back, but it won't match the market. So there are issues around that. But I guess everybody who goes into that knows that situation and understands it. And but it still allows people to get some money back, which could help with a deposit or something like that. So I think that's one scenario where it can work. But the same with Chapeltown co-housing, in the sense that the cooperative, it allows you some ownership, but the cooperative will always have control over the resale value. And that will be set by the co-op. Does that make sense, Callum?
Yeah, that does. And I think the co-op model is probably because you become a shareholder in the co-op, don't you, rather than the owner of the property directly. So it's your share in the co-op which you're recouping.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I'll go on if I can. So yeah, quite common scenario. We want to own as a collective and pay rent. So this effectively is the individuals are not having any part of the ownership, but they do have say in how the co-op runs. The actual legal ownership of the property is held with a legal identity, which in this case is a housing co-op. This is Machynlleth Housing Co-op, and effectively it's a business. And in terms of kind of legal ownership, the legal ownership is with the business and not with the individual members. The individual members of the business control everything that goes on within the house, and that allows you more say and more sense of ownership. There's no kind of personal profit from this model. There's no sense of taking anything back away from your participation in terms of money after you leave. It's literally what you give in, and what you take out is when you're only a member. So this is Machynlleth Housing Co-op. There's two houses in this co-op. One's owned and one's leased. One of the houses has been owned now for 3 or 4 years, and there's a whole kind of economic model around this type of housing co-op that works out that it's affordable if each room costs between £30,000 and £40,000 to buy. So if you're looking at a 4-bed house and the purchase cost is about £160,000, then the model works on that basis. Just admitting somebody. And again, this is mortgage with deposit raised from loan stock. And the different economic levers at play here, different cogs. And briefly, this is a housing co-op that we're supporting at the moment called Tygfredin in Machynlleth. And I'll just talk you through what they're doing in relation to loan stock. So they've got their capital requirements, how much it costs to build a house, which is, to buy the house, which is 280,000, and the breakdown there roughly of the different parts in their financial model. We've worked with a financial modeler, and the financial modeler has worked with the housing co-op to identify how much money they need to get from the Ecology Building Society in terms of mortgage, and how much they need to get in terms of loan stock from investment from the community. And there's quite a kind of complicated process going through looking at the different elements of their rental income, how much they can afford to pay in rent every month, and how much they'll have to pay back in different interest rates from the Ecology Building Society. And in terms of the loan stock is cheaper than mortgages, but it has to be paid back after 5 years, whereas the Ecology Building Society mortgage is going to be more expensive, but it can be paid back after 40 years. So you've got different rates of repayment for both those things. Usually loan stock is used as a deposit mechanism for housing co-ops. So, just as you would do as a private buyer, you're getting a mortgage, but you need a deposit. It's the same for housing co-ops, but rather than individuals paying that, the business is paying for it as a housing co-op. And the way they get their deposit is usually through loan stock. Sometimes it might be through kind of donations and things like that. I just wanted to draw your attention to this part of it. In this particular model, the housing co-op are looking to convert a garage into 2 more affordable rents, and it's going to cost £31,000 to do the garage conversion, but 2 members of the co-op are also putting in time in supporting the builder to do this project. And that's can be an important source of financing, is actual member participation and member time. And again, this is what their kind of financial model looks like. And to do this, they've had to create a loan stock offer, and there you can see they're asking people to donate multiples of £1,000 and giving them some options to keep the money in the housing co-op for 5, 10, 15 and 20 years, and even to get to decide what level of interest rate they're going to ask for in return. And some people do kind of say the 0% rate because what they actually want to do is not make any money, but support the housing co-op. It's important to say that this is unsecured investment. So there is a danger of losing money that's invested, and you don't have any of that kind of loan guarantee that you might do that you would do if you put your money into a bank. So yeah, it's important to point that out. Housing co-ops fail very rarely, so it doesn't happen very often that people lose their money, but it is possible, and it's important if you're maintaining a relationship with people to have a very secure financial model that means that there's very low chance of people losing their money, because you don't want that to happen. Hugh, there's more questions.
Yeah, I was just about to jump in there. Can you, first of all, take a Fredin, that's 5 people currently involved with scope for 2 more, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. And then there's a question from Adam Land, which I think Adam's probably best if you ask that one yourself. Are you able to put your mic on?
Yeah, just with the financial model and the projections, with mortgage repayments and the interest, obviously interest rates are quite low at the moment, but you are potentially going to rise. And I guess we're kind of struggling with where to model to, because it's a very significant difference with a 3% interest on a mortgage, and then if they rise to 7% or even higher than that, then it's going to become unviable. Yeah, like, is there a standard range that you would model to?
Yeah, so I don't know if you're working with Radical Roots, but they have a kind of model that you can put in different rates of interest. And the Ecology Building Society actually sends out that model to different groups, so you can have a look at the range of different scenarios that might happen. I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because it's an unpredictable area, and it's almost certainly likely that mortgage rates will rise. And I guess it's having some flexibility within your financial model to make sure that you can cope with some of that. So I can send you on the financial model to have a look at. Or if you're already talking to Ecology Building Society, or if you start a conversation with them, they can send the model out. Are you based in Wales, Adam?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we can have a conversation around. Are you with a particular group at the moment?
Yeah. Well, we haven't started. We're in fairly early stages.
Okay, cool. Shall I drop you an email afterwards, and we can
That'd be great. Yeah.
Let's do that. Cool. Thanks, Adam. Any more at the moment, Hugh?
I think that's everything covered for now.
Great. Scenario number 6. Now, all the previous scenarios have been for people who want to live in the houses themselves. And it's important to say that there are scenarios where people don't want to live in the houses, but they just want to help other people live in them. And this is one of those scenarios. This is student co-op homes. Again, we've had those at the network events, which are all recorded and put on the Communities Creating Homes YouTube channel, so you can go and find out more about them. But this is a multi-stakeholder cooperative, and they really act as a way of gathering finance from a wide range of different sources and make it available to smaller groups. So that might be because they have a longer track record of developing housing projects, and track record can be really important to some investors and to some funders, and also to mortgage companies in some circumstances. And it can sometimes be because their particular legal form, in this case multi-stakeholder cooperative, can access funds that a smaller housing co-op couldn't. So in this model, the parent organisation gets the funding together and then buys a property and then leases it to a single housing co-op. And again, it's mortgage, community investment, grant loan, a similar sort of picture. But the parent organisation, as you can see from this graphic, is managing the relationship, is managing the financial support and bringing the money in and managing the property and working with individual student housing co-ops and supporting them in running their kind of individual different projects. So they will purchase the property and then get rent back to finance their debt repayments and any other costs associated with that management model. So just to point, oh, I beg your pardon, I've skipped a couple of slides there. Just to point out, funding is not just about getting the money in, it's about managing long-term relationships with funders. And there's a balance with that. And there's also kind of structures around that of how you keep up the communication with people and how you make sure that people are onboarded to your project and supported through the project all the way through the life of the project. So you're not sort of just going for funding and getting like some quick money in. You actually have to maintain those relationships throughout the life of the project and work out how you're doing that as part of this process. Here you can see this is another project in York that's trying to move on site at the moment. It's gone through a lot of the process already, but you can see where this is another model where there's a community land trust in this case that's owning the land and then leasing it to a smaller housing co-op. At the moment they've just got one housing co-op and they want to develop more, but you can see how they draw in different support from different groups, from grant funders, local investments, residents, the council, and volunteer time again in terms of labour, and then make land and property available to smaller groups who need that support. And again, it's the Community Land Trust. Your Space will manage a lot of the relationships going on there between the investors, between the housing co-op, and then the housing co-op, you can see on the bottom part of that diagram, will manage the relationship with the residents and the members of the housing co-op. So you have very clear kind of structures and relationship structures about how that's all going to work. Finally, these are really important relationships, and we've talked a lot about in this series of webinars. And going back to the first part of it, where we're looking at different legal forms that Casey was going through and looking at your aims and values and what your purpose is, and then through to financing. And this is a circular process, and you have to go through this, look at these relationships throughout each different stage, as I was trying to highlight at the beginning of the talk, and keep on reflecting back about whether this is all working. The purpose will affect where you can get the finance from, and the legal form will affect that as well. So it's important to look at those relationships all the time as you're going on, and not to let your purpose slide out of view because you're trying to get the right financing, or because you've chosen the wrong legal form or something like that. So that's just something I wanted to share with you at the end. And as Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done. It's obviously quite a lot of complicated spreadsheets and financial modelling in there, but there's support available. If you're in England, there's community-led housing hubs available in different regions, so you can get in contact with them. There's a website, communityledhomes.co.uk, which you can access with loads of different resources about all this sort of stuff. And then if you're in Wales, we're really happy to work with any groups in Wales, and we have our own resources on the website, and also individually from us. And I will now stop sharing the screen, and we can have a chat. If there's any more questions, and I'll try and upload a couple of resources unless Casey's already beaten me to it. Thanks everybody for listening. Thank you. Mandy. Hi, Mandy.
Hi. I'm just wondering, you were saying about the radical roots model. We're looking at going down that way. but you also mentioned the financial, what was it called? Modeler. If we were looking at doing stuff with them, would we still in Wales have support from you in terms of the kind of funding we might need to have a modeler and to look at exploring what we were looking for? Because you mentioned there's some funding in the exploration phase as well that would be available.
There is. So there's different parts of the Wales Cultural Centre for our project, Communities Creating Homes. And we have these different phases, and one of them is called Explore, which is specifically for groups that hasn't identified exactly what they want or a property that they're interested in, and they want to look at a range of different models and different kind of financial propositions and so on and so forth. And we would put you in touch with DTA Wales and you would sign up for that programme, and there's £2,500 worth of grant support through that programme, and also access to mentoring. I don't know whether financial modelling comes into that. That's a conversation that we could take up with you. Okay. And then the project that I mostly work in is the enable part of the project, which is when a group has identified exactly what legal structure they want, and they've maybe got a view of what property they want to buy, and or what land they're looking at. They know where they want to be, essentially. And we would provide most of that support from you as community-led housing advisors. So myself and Casey are on the call, advisors, and there's Claire as well. And in addition to that, we can access consultancy support. So we're not trained financial modelers, but we can access support for you from people who are. So we would talk to you. There's a kind of viability assessment that we'd need to go through. So we want to make sure that a project is basically viable before kind of going down that route of detailed kind of financial modelling. But we'd have conversations with you about that and work out whether that was the case.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, I think we know what model we want. We have no idea where. Do you know what I mean? Wales is kind of most likely. We've got half of us in Wales and half of us not, if that makes sense, but only just over the border from each other.
Yeah.
So kind of, yeah. I mean, and the ones of us in Wales are keen to stay in Wales. So seems to me that that's, but, you know, apart from that, we're open. It's finding the right place, isn't it? But it'd be really good to have your support along the way with this.
Yeah, so we can support groups who want to build in Wales, but we can't really support groups who are building in England, unfortunately. But
no, I mean, we want to build in England, so
there will be support for those groups through the different community-led housing hubs. But it'd be a different kind of people that you talk to. Yeah. But I can send you links to that in terms of, you know, if you do have a. Depending on where you live, you know.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's
okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I've got a question, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine, Adam.
Yeah, like I guess we've noticed, and it came across in this presentation, that from Welsh Government there's a lot less support. It seems like less support for community-led housing than there is in England. And I was wondering, like, what the reasons were for that, and also, like, is it something that would change, or is this something quite set in stone? Like, I'm thinking the difficulty becoming a registered social landlord, and the fact that you can't draw down the social housing grant or innovative housing fund unless you have a RSL partner, whereas in England community land trust can access the equivalent of the social housing grant. Yeah, is it something that's likely to change and we could push to change, or is it like this is the system, you've got to work within it?
So one of part of our role really within the project is to work with Welsh Government to see what change can be created, and we're doing that constantly. And we've had conversations with them in terms of developing more funding for projects. Nothing's been committed at the moment, but we're hopeful that we can kind of move things forward. But yeah, unfortunately, at the moment, there is more funding, well, less funding in Wales, I should say, rather than the other way around. It's great that there's funding in England. But yeah, that's something we want to work on. Hugh, do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I just just as you started talking, Adam, I hit enter on a long screed I'd written in the comments box in response to your question. So yeah, Welsh Gov have committed in their programme for government, which came out a month or two ago, to, I mean, you can read the quote in the chat box now, but to great support for community-led housing. So we're working with them on what that will look like. Nothing like, as Alan said, there's nothing to sort of update people on as yet, but it's something we're focusing on as the West Co-op Centre, and we hope to help overcome some of the issues and barriers that you guys are facing in terms of getting community-led housing off the ground in Wales. So yeah, watch this space, and as I said in the chat, if you do end up meeting up with Alan after this, or having a chat with Alan, he can take you through the support that's available to you now, and we will just keep we're pushing at an open door, I think, given that commitment from Welsh Gov. We just need to keep pressing on.
Great, cheers.
I think just to add to that, it's really important that you've said that, because we can feed that back, and we're always looking for that from groups. So if there's any kind of barriers that you come across and you identify that, then the more you can communicate with us around that, then the better, really, because we need groups out there telling us that this is what they want and need to move forward, so we can feed that back. Yeah. Brilliant. Is there any more questions? I am just now trying to upload. So I've uploaded the financial plan for community groups, which takes you through some different processes. And then we've got this, it's saying a disk error. Okay, I don't know why it's saying that. But we also have a funding and finance document, which it's not allowing me to upload that for some reason. So yeah, that's a shame, because that's really helpful in terms of different funding sources that you can access.
Can we get that out by email to attendees afterwards, Alan?
Yeah, we'll definitely do that.
Right.
Okay, I've just realised I am recording all this. So I will stop recording, and